Hi there. In this tutorial I thought I'd go back over the basics of animation using Blender. There's been a few changes and a few subtle changes over the past few years with enhancements to the menu system and so on, so I thought it would be worth revisiting it and basically covering most of the techniques for animating objects in Blender. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. Feel free to comment or ask questions or even dislike the video. And if you don't like the video, I'd be very interested to see what the issues you spotted were so that I can improve going forward. If you're a Patreon supporter, I do upload these files for any use available to my Patreon supporters, and I upload tutorials quite regularly. So let's start the tutorial. So to begin with, let's just add a couple of items to the scene so that we can begin to explore animation. So we'll start with the basic cube to begin with, and we'll go into orthographic view, and you can see by default we've got a timeline with 250 frames on it. So a little bit about animation. First of all, you can see if I go to my scene settings, we've got the size in pixels of our render here. We can increase that percentage wise here or decrease it for that matter, and we've got a frame rate. So you've got a number of frame rates to choose from. For general purposes of animation, I would recommend 25 frames a second. That makes it easy then to composite with other things. It also makes it very compatible with a lot of compression settings that you might use, but there are other options as well, such as 29.97. that's a common one too, as is 24 frames a second. The more frames per second that you have, the more work needs to be done to animate your scene. That should become obvious as we go along. So first of all, basic animation. So I've got a cube here. I'm going to press G and X, which means it'll just move on the X axis. And I'm going to put my cube over here, and then hovering over the cube I'm just going to press I, and that gives me an option to insert a keyframe, and I'm going to select location. So a keyframe, you can see if we look down here, that's put a set of keyframes down here, little yellow marks at frame 1, and that's saying record the location of this object, which has of course X, Y and Z coordinates, as well as a relation to when in time that point was recorded. And then I'm going to change the time frame. Now if I don't change the time frame, if I just move this object perhaps where I want it to be, I'm just going to move it in X over to here, and then I start to move the time frame, which I can do by dragging here, or I can press play, or I can use the arrow keys. So if I just drag here, you can see the cube immediately bounced back, and that's because the last recorded position for that cube is just there. So it will always want to go back to there until I give it some other position that it needs to be at. So let's go to the end of the time frame, which is 250 frames of course, which at 25 frames a second of course will be 10 seconds. And now we'll move our cube to the other side of the display. And again, I will press I and select location. So we've got another set of keyframes now. So if I click here to go back to the beginning of the animation and then just press spacebar to play, you can see my cube moves as you might expect across the screen. And of course what Blender is doing is it's working out if I'm starting here at frame 1 and ending up here at frame 250, when I'm at frame 125, exactly halfway through, where should the cube be? So it's doing calculation to work that out, and then doing that of course for every frame. Something to be aware of with Blender in terms of the default animation. If you watch this cube, it starts slightly slower, speeds up to a point, and then slows down again as it reaches the end of the animation. This is called a Bezier curve. And the idea of this is obviously that it's somewhat more natural for most things to have an acceleration as they start from nothing, and then to decelerate just before they stop. If you imagine a car, it doesn't suddenly start moving, it speeds up slowly and then slows down again. But if that's not what you want, which it may not be, what we can do is just right click on one of those yellow dots and say interpolation mode, for example, linear. So they were all selected. So if we now press play, you can see there's no slow speeding up and then slowing down again. It is a constant speed until it suddenly stops, and the start is the same. And that, again, that may be what you want. And there are other options in there as well. So for example, we could have interpolation mode bounce. So if I play that, you can see that actually seems to go quite fast, hits the other end, and then even bounces back. So now Blender's working out for you what a bounce might look like. And there's quite a few others as well. So exponential is one of the other ones you might use. So with this one, You can see it's nothing to start with. It's very, very slow, and then it starts to speed up, and then of course exponentially speeds up until it hits the end, going at its maximum speed. Most common ones you're going to use are either the default Bezier or linear, and of course you can play it backwards as well. So if we look from an angle here, there's our cube moving. But of course we can animate more than just location. So it could be that I want to get, say, to frame 75, and I'm going to press I again, but I'm not going to store the location this time. I'm going to store the rotation, and then perhaps frame 150, and I'm going to rotate on the Y-axis. So we'll just have a couple of rotations. We'll end up like that, I think, and press I and rotation again. So you can see we've got two new sets of keyframes in there. So if I press play now, it's the same to begin with, and then suddenly it turns over and stops rotating just here, and then finishes its move. And finally, of course, another parameter that we could change, perhaps here, I'm going to press I and say scale, and then go to the middle here, somewhere around there. I'm going to scale by 2, and then press I and scale, and then go somewhere around here and scale by 0.5 perhaps, and I and scale again. So now we've got three things going on. We've got the location moving, we've got the scale going up, it does a rotation, and then the scale goes back down again, and it finally finishes. And obviously multiples of those can be combined. So I might go to the middle here. If you use these, by the way, they'll jump to the keyframes, and I might GZ lift that one up a little bit, and then press I and say location and rotation. So let's see what that's doing for us. You can now see it's going up as well now. The scale's going up, rotating, and continuing on down there back to the same level. So that's the most basic form of animation. Blender is doing what's called tweening. It's working out what this should look like in terms of scale, rotation, and location between the two keyframes that affect whatever parameter it is that is being animated. So what other methods of simple animation have we got? So I'm going to add another mesh, and we'll make this an icosphere just for something different. And this time I'm going to come down to object data properties, and we're going to be looking at this shape key section. So we're going to come up to, say, frame 50, somewhere around there, and then I'm going to click this plus over here. And the first time you do it, you get an entry called basis. This is basically the starting shape of my object. But in order to animate, I need another entry, at least one other entry, and you can do multiples. So I'll click the plus here, and you see it's added key 1, which is shape key 1. I'm now going to go into edit mode, and I think I'll select a few of the faces, and I'm going to scale them out like that. And that is now the shape for my first shape key. So I'll come out of edit mode, and you notice it's gone back, but we've got this option over here called value for key 1. And if I start to turn that up, you notice that distortion is coming back. Now we also have a range minimum and maximum here. The default is 0 and 1. What if I set the range minimum to -1? You notice this point here is now the middle. So if I scroll downward, you can see it's moving the same faces as I moved before, but it's moving them in the opposite direction. So I can now go from the shape that I created to the inverse of the shape that I created. And of course, it doesn't have to be this. It could be -10 to +10. So if I put this plus up to, say, 9 or wherever, you can now see we've got a more extreme version of it. So let's set this to 0.5 perhaps, and -0.5. So now it's slightly less than I distorted it originally, but it can be positive or negative. And of course, I'm at frame 50 now. If I hover over here, I can press I to add a keyframe. So it's turned a sort of yellowy color. And if we now go to frame 150, and I can turn that all the other way, press I again, and that's added a second keyframe. So if we come back to here and I press play, you can now see over time the shape changes. And as I mentioned, you can have more than one keyframe. So I'll add another one. We'll go into edit mode, and perhaps we'll select this set up here. Press O for proportional editing, and GZ, and we'll stretch the shape up like that. Perhaps we'll use a different shape, and I've now got a key 2 which will do that. So I could go back to frame 25, for example, start that one keyframing, come to somewhere in here, take that one up to 1, come over to here and set it back to 0 again. So if we see what that does, there's the top being distorted, there's the other one coming in, and there's that one coming back down again. So a little bit about controlling your keyframes at this point. Let's drag down another window and we'll turn that into what's called the dope sheet. Essentially, it's showing what I've got a preview of down here in the timeline, which is the keyframes for the object I have selected. You can do this, what I'm about to do here as well, so it's up to you, but as your scene gets more complicated with more object, you may find it easier to do it here. I've clicked somewhere other than one of these keyframes now in order to deselect them all. So I can now select one set of these keyframes and I can move them around. So I could take this one, press G as you normally do in Blender, and I could move it over to here. And that's obviously going to change the point at which that particular keyframe takes effect. And there you go. So I could press A to select them all and press S to scale and scale it down. I'm going to scale it even further than that. And then maybe move the whole lot up toward the beginning of the animation. So now it's going to move more quickly. So now it's going to move more quickly and much sooner in the animation. I can even Shift D and duplicate those points. Where you can see them joining, that means they're effectively the same keyframe. They hold the same information, so nothing would change between there. So we can just move that out to there. Let that go, and you can see it's doing that, and then it does it again. And we could even do something really weird, like sort of have them half overlapping. So one of the other things that we might want to do, I'm just going to stretch those out again so we cover a bit more of our animation. One of the other things we can do is use something called the graph editor, and this can be used on anything that you've keyframed. So I'm going to change this now to the graph editor here, and if you look carefully, it is a bit faint. You can see for this object I have selected, it's showing the keyframes. I can show them here, key 1 and key 2, and it's showing basically how they change over time. And you can see if I drag the timeline around how that's doing that. And I could take any one of these points and move it around. Let's use the default Bezier for this one, but you can see how that changes the shape. These handles will affect the direction that the interpolated points move. So this is basically showing how the data is being interpolated or tweened between these keyframes until it gets to the next keyframe. But there's something else we can do with this. So I'm going to select all those keyframes, we'll go to the beginning of the animation, and I'm going to delete them. So now there's no animation there. I've still got a bit of distortion left on it because that's how it was when I removed the keyframes, but there's nothing there for either of the keyframes. So I'm just going to select keyframe 2, and I'm just going to press I over the value just to add a keyframe. So you can see the keyframe is there. I haven't added another keyframe, so there's no animation per se at the moment. But we're now going to do a kind of procedural animation. So I've pressed N to bring up this side menu, and we'll go to modifiers. I've got this key 2 graph selected, and I'm going to add a modifier. And we've got a number to choose from. So let's just use built-in function for the moment. And you can see by default, it just adds a sine wave. So let's just press play and see what that's done. So you can see it's literally going back and forth on that keyframe in accordance with this simple sine wave. And we can change the amplitude of that sine wave. Obviously, I've got this limited to a max of 1 for this keyframe at the moment. We can change the phase multiplier. So that basically is changing the frequency, how often our sine wave varies over time. Can make it a little more slow there. And I think this sine wave is actually way too big at the moment. So I'm going to actually make it smaller, and then we'll be able to see the sine wave element of it a little better. And also you can see that we're not using the negative part of the sine wave because it stops as soon as it gets to halfway down. So we can change that by adding an offset. You can see I've gone too far there. So there we go. So I've got an amplitude of 0.5 and a value offset of 0.5. So as the range is 0 to 1, that makes sense. And you can see I turn those grids off, that our object is just varying nicely. We can add more than one modifier there. So I can add another modifier, and it could be a noise modifier, for example. So we've still got our sine wave there, but we've now got some noise on top. We can obviously play with that as well. So we can increase the scale. The scale for noise is it fast noise or slow noise, as it were. And then the strength, obviously, how much that noise affects everything. And phase, just where we are on the seed of the noise, as it were. So there's a lot of different options there, and you can create some interesting automated or procedural motion just using the graph editor, and in this case the shape key, but this would apply to anything that you've added keyframes for. So let's go to a new way to animate things in Blender. So I'm going to add some shapes now. I'm going to add cube and then another cube above that. We'll make that slightly smaller, and then another cube above that, which will make slightly smaller again. If we look over here, we've got cube, cube 01 and cube 02. But the big cube is obviously the one on the bottom. What if I want these shapes associated with each other such that they are able to be moved together as an object? Now obviously we could group them or join them or just select them together and we can move them and we could keyframe them. But sometimes we want Blender to also understand that there might be some interaction in how they work together. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. So I'm now going to add something called an armature. So if we come in here, we're just going to add a single bone. Armatures are done in bones. I'm going to go to wireframe view so that we can see this better. And again, we'll turn those grids off. And that's the bone. This isn't something that's renderable. It's a control. So I'm going to go to edit mode with this bone selected. And with just the top of the bone, this is the top, the pointy bit, and that is the bottom. You can select a couple of different shapes for these, but I'm just really going through quickly and showing the different ways of animating things in Blender. I'm going to press E and then just press escape and then G, Z, just so that we have created a new bone that is already attached to the one below, and take that to about the middle of that object, and then E and then just press return and then G, Z, and we'll take that one up to there. Don't worry too much about the size. So we've now got a set of bones that are inside these three shapes. As it's a single armature, I want them to affect a single shape. So I'm going to select each of these shapes and say Control J, which will join them. We'll call this cube set. And we've now got a single object, you can see there, which is our cubes. I'm now going to hold shift and select my armature and then press Control P. And you can see one of the options we get relates to the armature. And I'm going to say armature with automatic weights. So armatures work differently. This isn't an armature tutorial, so I'm really just showing the very basics of how we would animate things with an armature. But we come up here with the armature selected and we've got a pose option. So I can now select that armature and you see we've got a light blue line around it now. And if I press G, it will actually start to rotate. And without worrying too much about what's happening to the shape below it at the moment, you can see that's connected. And if I now do the same with a middle bone and just press G, now you can see those top two are moving together. We have got a problem in that the shapes are, if I rotate on the y-axis, the shape is distorting in a way we might not want it to do, and that's down to the influence weights. What I will want to do is actually move these around, and of course if I rotate that one, everything rotates. So we've already associated them together. But if I now go to Object Data Properties, you can see I've got three vertex groups now. If I go to Edit Mode and then I come up here and go to Weight Paint. So Weight Paint tells you how selected or how much influence a particular vertex group has. And then I select each of the vertex groups. You can see that we've got different weights coming up for each of these vertex groups. And these vertex groups have been automatically associated with the three different bones. So that will be the base bone there. And you can see that's only really associated with the bottom cube. If I select the middle bone, it is associated with the middle cube, although the weight gets a bit light at the top. Red is fully selected and blue is unselected, but it's also significantly affecting this one. And then if I select the top one, fully selected the top one, but it hasn't fully selected this one. Some of that's down to how I positioned those bones when I did it, but we can easily fix it by going into edit mode. If I go to the middle bone vertex group, Control L just to select all the vertices. So this should be 100% selected. It's already set to weight of 1. I'm just going to assign that. And then just to make sure, I'll select the one above it, Control L, and remove that. So there's no selection. And then the same to this one, remove that. If I now come out of edit mode, you can now see when the middle bone is selected, only that middle cube has maximum weight on it. And we then just need to do the same with that one. The others, fine. So we just go to bone 2, go to edit mode, just make sure there's nothing selected for the bottom cube and make sure there's nothing selected for the middle cube. And we already know the top cube is fully selected. So now if we come back to object mode, select our armature, we'll go into wireframe so you can see it more easily, although you can have these set so that they're in front of all objects, and then go into pose mode. We're now just affecting individual elements. The position of these points selects where they're going to pivot from. So that's the whole point of having those some way that you want them. So I might want to do something like that, for example. And now when I pivot that one, it pivots like that. That one pivots like that. And that one pivots everything. But what if I want to be able to move one of these bones, and rather than it just pivoting, I want everything else to move around as if they are connected, whether it's like a chain or an arm with bones in it and so on. It's not by accident that these armature points are called bones. So we can use inverse kinematics. And the easiest thing to do is to do that with object constraints, or specifically bone constraints. So I've gone to that top bone and I'm going to add a constraint, and it's going to be the inverse kinematics. Kinematics is about the science of movement. This is inverse kinematics. So it's rather than this moving this, which moves this, it's this one moving and then these moving to accommodate it, which is why it's inverse. So I've added the constraint inverse kinematics to that. I'm now just going to press G, and you can see already some weird stuff is happening in order to keep the whole thing joined together. Even the bottom one is moving around. Now you might not want that, especially if this was a body and this is an arm, and you control that with the chain length. So it's set to 0 at the moment, which essentially means infinite. But if I set that to 1 and now do this, you can see nothing really happens. It does what it did before. But now put it at 2 and I press G. I'm not rotating, I'm just pressing G. You can now see that middle cube is moving around, trying to stay in contact appropriately with the top cube. And I could have as long a chain as I wanted and it would do exactly the same thing. So that's as deep as I want to go really into armatures, but obviously what you can do is you can keyframe poses as well. So I could just press I and I could just say whole character. Could do the selected bones. I'll do selected bones in this instance, and then come over to here and perhaps bring it to there. I again, selected bone, and perhaps down to there, and I again, selected bone. So we now see what that does. We can see that's only stored the changes for that particular bone. But if I press I whole character there, come to the next point and then move everything here, perhaps I whole character, and then perhaps take it to there, I whole character, and now you can see the whole thing is moving around. This is a very simple way of animating bones, and there's a lot more to it than this. You can use the nonlinear animation editor in order to set up sequences. So that sequence might be a couple of steps from a walk, and you can then repeat those in order to have your character walk across the screen without having to keyframe each element as you go along, and many other things, flapping bird wings and so on. So that's the basics of armatures. Starting to get a little bit further away from the basics now. We can also use things like forces. So I'm going to add another cube and I'm going to put a simple particle system on it. I'm going to turn gravity off. So you can see it's just emitting particles now, and we'll give them a bit of a longer life than that. And we've just got a load of particles being emitted like so. So that's effectively an animation in itself, just emitting those particles. And there are a variety of options for affecting how they move and so on in here. But what I wanted to do was also show you that you can influence an animation using something called forces. So I'm going to add a force field, which will just make a wind field. So it's just inside there at the moment. And you can already see this wind force is now pushing those particles in a particular direction. Obviously, if we go to physics properties, we can affect the strength and so on. And there are other types of forces. So we could, for example, select a turbulence force. So rather than pushing it in one particular direction, this sort of moves the particles around in a turbulent way. And we can increase the strength of that. You can see they're sort of following an interesting path there. We can change the size of the turbulent flow, and we can add a flow element to it, which can do some interesting things as well. Not too easy to see there. So what I can do is perhaps reduce the size of those particles a little bit under the viewport display, perhaps slightly bigger than that, and then increase the number of them. We'll go for 7,000. You can see them all moving around in an interesting way there. And as I said, there are lots of different forces. There are things you can do with them. So you can add a fall off sphere as well, so that it will only influence things up to the point of the fall off. So you can see there, particles over here are being affected by this force field, but particles over here are not. That's all I really wanted to show you about forces as another mechanism for animation. And something else we can do is basic physics. So first of all, I'm going to add a plane, and then I'm going to add a cube above it. We'll make that a bit smaller. And again, I'm just going to add a simple particle system. If I press play, you can see we've got particles coming out. And then I'm going to select that plane, go to physics properties, and I'm going to say collision. Now you can see the particles are bouncing off it. So that's another way that we've imparted or directed an animation, because we've got what appears to be a physical plane deflecting these particles. And we can do things like add some damping so particles don't bounce infinitely off it and they bounce perhaps a little more realistically. If I extend the life of my particle system a little bit, be able to see that more. And with these collisions and things like this, they'll also affect other physical objects, which I'll show in a moment. So let's remove that cube. I'll add a UV sphere this time. And I've got just this and one more that I want to demonstrate. So I've got a sphere here. What's another way that I could animate that sphere? Well, I can use physics. So I come to here and I can do something called rigid body. It isn't obvious, but what I'm doing is I'm making this like a real object. So if I just press play there, my cube just drops. So already it seems to be influenced by gravity. So it's already been animated. However, it just fell through this object because this particular collision system doesn't work for physics. Get rid of that. And I'm going to add rigid body again, but this time if I just press play, the ground, as it were, will fall away as well. I don't want that. I want it to act like the ground, not fall, but deflect things. So if I come over to here and I say passive, and now when I press play, my ball hits it and stops. It's not bouncing terribly realistically, but it is at least recognizing that there is a surface there. And there's a number of different settings that you can play with in here. So we can increase bounciness, for example, and decrease friction, and we can do the same for this surface as well. So we can add some bounciness on there and decrease the friction. And sometimes you just need to move things around a little bit so that it does the calculation, but you can see it's bouncing a little there. And we could put an angle on it and it will bounce down and roll off. So there's another way that we can do some basic animation. So the final thing I wanted to show was really some simple way to animate something using geonodes. And there's many more complex ways. Obviously, I'm just showing the basics here. I'm just going to add a simple plane, and then I'm going to pull up a new window, and we'll make that the geometry node editor, and we'll just say new. Multiple ways we can do the next bit, but I'm just going to do it the simplest way. So I'm going to add a mesh icosphere, and we'll put that over here. Come back to my plane, and if I look in my collection, there's my icosphere. So I'm just going to grab that icosphere entry up there in the scene collection and drop it in here. I'm going to add under the geometry settings, a join geometry node and put that there because I want the plane to stay there. I don't want it to vanish. And then I can take my geometry from my icosphere and do that. And it just appears. So that's created my icosphere. I want it to be a little bit smaller. So I'm going to add under geometry, a transform node and just drop that in there. And we'll set the scale to perhaps 0.25. So we've got a much smaller object now. And here comes the very simple way that you can animate using a geometry node. And obviously you can do much more complex things. I'm going to set my object to just have a color in the viewport so we can see it better against the ground. And now I want to translate it up. So that's got it out of the ground. And if we go to frame 25, which would be 1 second, of course, I'm going to set the X location over here, press I. I'm also going to record the scale, and then I'm going to set the time frame to perhaps 100 and move the X over to here, perhaps move the Z down, and perhaps set the scale to 0.1. And then I'm going to press I, hovering over those two sections. And now if I come back to here and press play, you can see my object moves and shrinks and goes over to there. So you can imagine you can do some quite complicated things with the geometry node just to move your objects around or scale them, rotate them, and do anything else you want to do with them. So I hope you found that very brief introduction to multiple ways of animating in Blender. If you did, let me know. If you've got any questions or comments or observations, I'm more than happy to see those in the comments below. I do read them all. And if you enjoyed that tutorial, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks a lot.